Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and welcome to another edition of RegWatch on GFN.TV. What happened in the UK over disposable nicotine vapes is a shock. For all of the talk about the UK's enlightened approach to nicotine vaping, the country is now set to ban disposable vapes, and harsh new restrictions on flavors are just around the corner. But the qualities that made disposable vapes persona non grata in the UK, those being efficacy in helping smokers to quit, ubiquity, and high enjoyment, are not exclusive to disposables. Years before, these very same traits were responsible for kneecapping Juul in the United States and other countries around the world. Joining us today to discuss the battle over nicotine vapes and safer nicotine products is Dr. Ariel Selya, a behavioral scientist at Pinney Associates, a US-based firm that provides consulting services on tobacco harm reduction to Juul Labs. Dr. Selya, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch.
Thanks for having me, Brent.
Well, look, let's start with Pinney Associates. On the website, under tobacco harm reduction, it states that, quote, since October of 2019, Pinney Associates has been working exclusively with Juul Labs to advance relative risk-based regulation of nicotine and tobacco products, and that smokers should not have to suffer unnecessarily and risk dying prematurely because of how they get their nicotine. Let me ask you, in the past 5 years, have regulators and public health officials helped in any way to alleviate the suffering and unnecessary risk regarding the use of nicotine?
Well, I think in theory, regulation is important to have product standards and accountability, but there's a lot to be said about the specific regulation today. So I think there's an overly focused, it seems like they're overly focused on the youth issue and not really taking into account the importance of safer products for adults who smoke to switch away from cigarette smoking. So I think that appreciating that bigger picture is missing from some of the regulation, and also sort of a lack of attention to detail for unintended consequences. And maybe a lack of recognizing that cigarettes and e-cigarettes are substitutes for each other. And if you regulate to act on one, then there's going to be unintended consequences on the other.
Yeah. Do they even accept harm reduction as a theory or strategy when it comes to tobacco use?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they speak to that in some way. So I think partly they do. I don't think they're fundamentally opposed to it, but I think some of the effects that come out maybe undermine that goal.
Why do you think so little progress has been made?
I think in reality, just maybe in spite of the regulatory efforts, there has been a lot of progress. So if you look at trends of youth smoking, young adult smoking, even older adult smoking, smoking is declining faster than we would have expected 10 years ago. And so that's a huge effect. Anything that reduces smoking rates is definitely a win for public health. So and that is, it's hard to exactly attribute that to e-cigarette use. Could be due to other tobacco control efforts, but consistently in the U.S. and in several other countries across different regulatory environments, what we see is that in the groups that are uptaking e-cigarette use the most, they have the largest declines in smoking, to the extent that it's sort of unprecedented in many cases.
Let's dig into the Juul issue a little bit, because I believe what was done to Juul is a tragedy and may have cost lives. So what happened to Juul in the US, and are there any parallels with what is occurring now in the UK with disposables?
So I'll just touch on this briefly. This was before my time with Juul, but I'll refer to what's in the published literature, which is that Juul voluntarily withdrew their non-tobacco, non-menthol flavors in various stages between late 2018 and late 2019. And soon after that, the FDA announced that they would prioritize enforcement efforts against non-tobacco, non-menthol flavored pod products. So because of these two decisions, there was a widespread removal of non-tobacco, non-menthol flavored pod e-cigarettes. And what happened is that there was a large shift towards disposable use instead, especially among youth. And a lot of these disposable brands have since gotten, MDO'd by the FDA. And so they're still kind of prolifically available at many places. which there's differing opinions on. But that, I think the fundamental story there is that the market shifts to whatever product is available once you make a large change like that. So talking about the UK now, even within the THR community, I think there's a lot of disagreement about disposables because there are concerns about environmental waste and lack of regulation and standards in these products. But on the other hand, there is some evidence from Harry Tatton Birch and colleagues, for example, showing that the uptake of disposables has, if anything, been accompanied by maybe a slight decline in cigarette smoking. So it's not just people that were already using e-cigarettes changing to disposables. It's not necessarily among non-users. It seems to be having a potential effect of getting adult smokers to switch away when previous types of e-cigarettes had not been able to do so.
And I think that's really at the heart of my point is that Juul was very successful because of its ubiquity, because it really did work. If you were a smoker, you could turn to a Juul, try it, and maybe a week or two later become an accidental quitter. That story is legion when it comes to the vaping world. So, you've got enjoyment, you've got efficacy, and you've got ubiquity. These are the things that seem to work the best to get people off smoking. And they also seem to be the things that exacerbate the teen use issue to orders of magnitude.
Yeah, that's really the heart of the issue is that there's so much fear and concern about youth use that they are wanting to take anything away that could be potentially attractive to youth and pulling youth to use these products. But then the other side of the coin is, well, what happens to the appeal for adults who smoke that want to switch away from cigarettes? And I think the other issue there is what would these youth have done otherwise? Because when 20 years ago, before there were e-cigarettes, they would smoke unflavored cigarettes. So even though I think there's a conflation or maybe a misinterpretation of the evidence, or jump to conclusions perhaps, where just because youth are using flavors, it doesn't mean that flavors are causing the use necessarily. In going back to the shifts in the market that we talked about earlier, there is evidence that people will shift to whatever products are available.
Dr. Selya, consulting on tobacco harm reduction for Juul, what does that entail?
So as a behavioral scientist, we study what happens when people use Juul products. There's a couple of studies out now looking at a large study of adult Juul purchasers. And it wasn't a cessation trial. It was completely naturalistic. The participants were not expected to quit smoking. There was no assumption or expectation that they would quit. It's just like, okay, you bought a Juul product, participate in the survey over, a year or two about what you end up doing. And after 1 year, over 50% of adult established smokers switched away from cigarettes 1 year after Juul purchase. And that rate continued to rise a bit more throughout the second year. Another study that I was involved in with this was looking at dual use. So there's a lot of controversy in the literature about, well, is it bad to dual use cigarettes and e-cigarettes? Because when you look at in certain analyses cross-sectionally, it seems like dual users might have higher exposure levels and greater cigarette consumption. But when you follow them longitudinally, actually, it seems like dual use is a transition for most people away from smoking. So it's part of a natural transitional stage. And it's characterized by substantially reduced cigarette consumption.
Dr. Selya, tell us, how did you come to work for Pinney Associates?
So this was a long story in the making, I think. I had been in academia for about 10 years before I even really heard of Pinney Associates. And I was studying adolescent smoking behavior. I started this in my postdoc in 2010, 2011, and studying, the kind of trajectory of nicotine dependence and smoking addiction. And then when I was a junior faculty at University of North Dakota in 2014, the e-cigarette story started getting big. And, at first I just kind of stuck with analyzing cigarettes, but I did at first sort of buy into the public health message that I was hearing at the time about e-cigarettes, which was that they're harmful, they're attracting kids, and it acts as a gateway to cigarette smoking. So I'm ashamed to say now, but I completely bought into this, and coming from more of a methodological background, I started realizing that there were some assumptions being made in the literature that hadn't been tested yet, and I thought, oh, here's a good paper I can do. So, for example, it's often assumed that the gateway mechanism occurs through nicotine dependence. So, youth who start using e-cigarettes then develop nicotine dependence because of it, and then change to combustible cigarettes. So I analyzed this and was surprised by what I found because I didn't find any evidence for this pathway actually occurring. And there was I was working on kind of this and one other closely related paper at a time that seemed to indicate substitution between the two products. So young adults who use e-cigarettes tended to smoke less frequently. So it was almost an offsetting effect. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. And I had never heard about that before. I'd never heard of anything besides the kind of alarmist narrative about youth. And so I changed my mind with my own data. I wrote this up and submitted it. And then I started thinking, I was really engaged in this story now because what I was finding in the data was so completely different from what I had been hearing. And eventually I got into population level trend modeling. So I thought, okay, how else can I test the gateway hypothesis? And how can I test whether that's occurring or not? And I realized that if under the gateway hypothesis, if that's true, then there should be more youth cigarette smokers now than there would be otherwise if e-cigarettes hadn't appeared. So I did some population level trend modeling and found the exact opposite, that the rates of cigarette smoking among youth decline faster after e-cigarettes appeared. And can we conclusively attribute that to e-cigarette use? No, because there were some policy changes at the time. But part of this is comparing across different types of evidence, and there's a lot of different types of evidence. So there's population level trends, and we can show this in young adults too. The rates of smoking among young adults is now lower than it used to be, and this is the group that has taken up e-cigarettes. And the same story is consistent across different countries. So it's been shown in Canada, England, New Zealand, Germany, a lot of very consistent findings related to the population level articles. So back to my transition to Pinney Associates, I was kind of a lonely academic publishing these articles, and I would reach out to people with different opinions and offer to collaborate, and none of that really went anywhere. I felt like my work was very interesting, but being ignored by my academic colleagues. I was finding it hard to get grants as well because I would get pushback from the reviewers saying like, what are you doing? Are you going to encourage e-cigarette use among youth? So it was almost like I had the wrong opinion for the funding agency, and I can't say that that's the only. I can't attribute, my failure to get grants only to that. It could have been just like, maybe I didn't write very well, or maybe I didn't propose something novel enough, but it certainly didn't help having the opposite opinion from many of the public health agencies.
Let's just put a point on this gateway because that's the most dire, accusation I believe that tobacco control can make about nicotine vapes and their use by youth. And we had this huge moral panic in the U.S. in 2018 and 2019, which of course was crazy over teen use of e-cigarettes, and Juul was at the heart of it. And now 5 years later, you have the National Youth Tobacco Survey out in 2023, and not only is vaping use cratered amongst that age group, but the people that were teens and were involved in that moral panic, they're now 23, 24 years old, and smoking is cratered at the youth level.
Yeah, that's right.
So how can the FDA and CDC and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and Bloomberg and all of these people, are they lying, to continue on in trying to make people think that gateway is an issue?
I have to give people the benefit of the doubt because having been kind of an academic in a bubble and susceptible to, the narrative that you hear and by the public health agencies and the priorities of the funding agencies as well, I don't think that this is necessarily malicious. I think they're genuinely concerned about youth use. And as far as NYTS data, there is a legitimate reason, or there was for a while, to question the trends. So COVID happened, and that really disrupted data collection. And in 2021, NYTS data collection shifted to partially at home, partially in school. And because of this, there's a well-documented methodological artifact that means you can't compare the 2021 estimates to other years. So as a result, it was legitimate at first when 2021 came out to say, okay, even though it decreased, we can't really trust this decrease. That ended up being partially true from what I believe now. It was a larger than it was a decline, but it was larger than the actual decline. But then on the other side of things, coming out of 2021, people now saw that there was an uptick in 2022, but it's not a true uptick because, of course, you can't compare. The methodological artifact is still there for 2021. So I've actually submitted a couple, just in the past couple of weeks, 2 or 3 post-publication critiques about papers that have falsely interpreted an uptick in 2022 when it was really just a methodological artifact. And now that 2023 is out, there's, that I think that kind of seals the deal. 2023 shows a further decline from 2022, and those 2 years are comparable. So I don't think there's any more room for doubt.
So let me ask you, Dr. Salya, is there bad science coming out of tobacco control?
There's some of it's bad. Some of it's I don't want to attribute ill intention to all of these studies. I think some of them are generally have never heard of the tobacco harm reduction side of things, just as I hadn't when I was a junior faculty. But I do see some papers that it's hard to see how it's not dishonest the way that some of the results are spun. So if you look at the results kind of in isolation from the narrative, and then you read what's been presented in the abstract, which is what most people read, sometimes it's very biased pessimistically, when it's kind of a good news story if you take a fuller look at the results that are presented.
Taking a look at your work now at Pinney and with Juul Labs, has there been pushback from colleagues in academia regarding that work you do?
I wouldn't say there's been any direct pushback or hostility. I just kind of feel like the work that I do is being ignored, but I also felt that back when I was in academia publishing, hey, look, the predictions of the gateway hypothesis are not holding up. So it hasn't really been a change, and that's kind of why I ended up at Pinney Associates, because I didn't feel like I was engaging with other academics to the extent that my research I thought warranted. And so Pinney Associates, I felt like I could do more good for public health.
But there are issues, though, with research that has been funded or supported by what's considered a tobacco industry company, which is what Juul is considered. I might disagree with that a little bit, but of course, Juul is not PMI or Juul is not BAT. However, they are considered to be the same. And talk to us a little bit about some of the kind of pushback that happens around the fact that Juul is involved.
Yeah, so it is a lot harder to publish with an affiliation, because many journals have a blanket policy that they won't accept any submissions that are funded by industry or with industry affiliated authors. So that really cuts down our publishing options. The other thing is, even if the journal doesn't have a strict policy, sometimes they think that it's suspect nevertheless. We're always very careful to be transparent about our disclosures and our conflicts, but sometimes that's not enough. It's considered not reliable. Whereas our attitude is let's disclose it and let the reader decide for themselves. But it seems like it's harder and harder to even get a platform to publish our science.
So in October of 2022, you're a co-author on a paper that was published and then the next year retracted by the journal BMC Public Health in July of 2023. What conclusions did that paper make, and for what reason was it retracted?
So that paper was another population level trend paper. It was looking at different age groups of adults in US data, so NHIS data, and looking at the association between uptake of e-cigarettes and the decline in cigarette smoking. And just like I've found for adolescents, and just like it's been reported in many other countries, the degree of e-cigarette uptake was associated with larger declines in cigarette smoking. So this was especially true of young adults, for example, who take up e-cigarettes to the greatest degree. And we all, in that paper, we also split it by other demographic groups, essentially finding the same thing, that the more this group uptakes e-cigarettes, the larger the farther they decline in cigarette smoking. So that was the conclusion of the paper. The reason for retraction, when we received the original criticism from an anonymous author, it was a litany against Juul funding to begin with, because this was a Juul funded publication. But let's keep in mind, this is CDC data. It's publicly available data. Anybody can download the data set and redo the analysis if they think that we made an error. But the criticism letter was really just about Juul funding and previous publications that Juul did. So there was a criticism about, Juul paid so much money for this monograph special issue. But on the other hand, this is like standard academic publishing fees. Like any NIH grant would pay the same amount of money for the same product. So really just a misunderstanding of like academic publishing. Furthermore, the criticism did identify a couple of methodological issues. So one key assumption on, what year did e-cigarette use start? Because they were introduced in the US around 2007, but use was really negligible for a couple of years. There's a number of other studies saying that somewhere around 2010 to 2014 is when, use became really noticeable at the population level. So we had reasons to choose this particular cutoff and make this assumption. And the editor and the anonymous critic was very hung up on this, saying, no, this completely invalidates the results. But the thing is, we addressed this during peer review, and we ran even more sensitivity analyses saying, okay, if you don't like this assumption, we'll use this other assumption instead, and we get the exact same results. So we felt that the criticisms were based on issues that were raised and that we addressed during peer review. And we've made all correspondence with the journal, including the initial reviews available on OSF.
Yeah, it's Well, they're attacking over niggling issues, and that issue shouldn't have gotten you retracted. It was basically the Juul issue. Is it possible to think that if money comes from the NIH, that doesn't come with bias?
I think it is a bias because the NIH has their funding priorities. So back when I was applying for grants as an academic, I did feel the pressure to kind of conform with the priorities and the assumptions of the funding agency. And like I said, my disagreement of my own research with the assumptions of the public health community, I think did get me into trouble. Like they're not going to fund that research. So I think it's, when you're a faculty member, like I don't want to say that everybody is, inherently biased. Like they might not even be aware of it, but as a faculty member, you have to do what you need to do to survive. And more these days, that includes getting grants from NIH or other funding agencies. So if you don't have a reason to distrust what they're telling you, then it's kind of natural to nudge people into doing this type of research. But I do think that it's a conflict of interest that should be disclosed.
From what I understand, NIH will pick a side on an issue and only fund their side.
That's what it seems like in my experience.
Dr. Selya, I know that you're going to be doing a workshop, co-workshop with Clive Bate at the Global Forum on Nicotine, which is the annual conference on safer nicotine products and tobacco harm reduction. Coming up is GFN 24, again this June 13th to 15 in Warsaw, Poland. Let me ask you, why is an event like GFN important, and can you share some details on the workshop?
So I really like GFN because it's a forum where it has so many different types of people there. So I go to a number of conferences all year, ranging from industry conferences to pure academic conferences. And GFN's a really nice mix that includes the consumer groups as well. And as a recovering academic, I like to make sure that I'm getting out of my bubble and talking to people that are actually affected. I will be co-hosting a panel with Clive, and we are still figuring out exactly what to do with it, but it's going to be related to the weekly lit reviews that we do.